If you think about it, the energy underneath denial is a fierce protection for our loved ones or a fierce protection of ourselves. There's something too painful. Maybe if I can just make it go away. Maybe if I give enough money. Maybe if I let them do what it is they want to do. Maybe if I don't set boundaries, then everything will be okay.
I feel like other problem is if the house is on fire, you know who to call for help. You're going to make that phone call if you just see signs of smoke. But when it comes to addiction, it's not like people know, oh, we need to visit Heather's website now. We need to learn about how do we intervene.
It seems like families that work like systems, which they do, have someone who is in pain or suffering, our identified patient, this anorexic teen, because it seems like there's a payoff for the family in having someone in there sick. Let's go in and look at these family dynamics because it's unconscious. We have made mistakes. We do make mistakes. But also understanding that if you come in and really work to repair those things, if you're in recovery yourself, and that a lot of it just boils down to brain chemistry.
Welcome to the Why Intervention Podcast. I am your host, Christopher Doyle. Today, I am excitedly joined by Heather Hayes. Heather is the founder and CEO of Heather R. Hayes and Associates, Inc. She is a master's level licensed counselor in the state of Georgia and a board-registered interventionist. With over 35 years of experience in treating clients with complex mental health issues and the full spectrum of addictive disorders, she has worked with clients of all ages and specializes in the treatment of trauma. As the globe's most prominent authorities on these topics, she is widely recognized for her trauma-informed, responsive approach to intervention. She's joining us today. I'm super excited. Thank you so much, Heather, for coming on.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. Good to connect with you too.
So I'm an unapologetic fanboy. You know, when I first discovered the intervention process, it was something that I just thought that families everywhere should be far more aware of than they are. And as I began to do research into, various different interventionists and people that really seemed to have their things together, that really knew what they were doing, you were, of course, one of the very best people that I discovered. And your website has just become that much more of a prominent, strong player in solid information and sharing that with families. So I just want to honor you in that.
Thank you. Thank you. That was my goal with the website is there's so many different questions and not just about intervention, but, like what is delusional disorder? Why does a family system have to be involved? So I try to put out every week or so, well, at least once a week, a blog, and then it's multi-purposed. I really did it so I could hand it out to my families, have it on the website if people needed information, so that I could just be of service however I possibly could be. So thank you for that. That means a lot.
So I think a great place to start would be, you just mentioned delusional disorder, and
Yes.
I talk about the difference between denial and delusion pretty often. And so I'd be curious what delusional disorder, with someone as knowledgeable as yourself. See, this is going to be great because usually I'm riffing from my personal experience and clinical experience also, but not to the degree that you have the clinical experience. So the delusional disorder, how do we explain that?
Let me back up a little bit and say that, so my background is a clinical background. Went to graduate school, undergrad at Emory, did my master's degree and master's work up in Boston. And so because of that, I often am utilized and do a lot of mental health interventions. Some have no substance abuse at all involved. And so they're very complicated and they're very complex. And so when we look at mental health issues, they usually manifest themselves in one of three areas. And sometimes there's a lot of overlap. So there's what we call the mood disorders, which have to do with my mood, my affect. That's where you get depression, anxiety. Then they're what we call the thought disorders. And it really, a person's thinking becomes dysregulated. So that's where you have bipolar type 1, schizophrenia, delusional disorder. And then the third is always in relation. So the first two, mood disorders, thought disorders, we only need ourselves there. The third is where our relationships with others become dysfunctional. And so with that, we have our personality disorders and things get chaotic, but you have to have someone else there generally to make that, to have that really play out. So with a delusional disorder, again, a person's biochemistry of their brain is generally off and their thinking becomes distorted. Often the thing that's specific and interesting to me about delusional disorder is that often people will not be delusional in a lot of areas of their lives until you get to one specific incident. So, for example, I had a client who worked in a very high profile finance job, was able to navigate that, had a family, but also had a delusion that there were three entities that were out to get him. One was a fast food restaurant, one was a church, one was another company. And there was no basis to that. And so once he began to get locked into that or thinking about it, then, it became rigid. He wasn't able to move out of it. And it impaired a lot of places in his life because if he thought, for example, this fast food restaurant was out to get him, he might drive erratically. He might lock the kids in the car and not let them get out. So again, it's a mental health issue that happens, again, on that thinking continuum. And so part of what makes it more complicated than schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia is that there are only specific areas that it tends to manifest or play out. Which denial, again, I think about denial and how it manifests itself. And denial means there's something there that's so painful, I don't want to see it. Or there's something that's happening to my loved one that's so painful, I want to make the pain go away. And so often I always talk to families about not trying to weaponize some of the terms that over time we've weaponized in our field. Like we'll call people enablers, or we'll say you're in denial, or we'll, say, really horrific things like the families are sicker than the person with the substance use disorder. And so I've tried to work really hard to help depathologize that and really look at the energy underneath it. So for example, with denial, if you think about it, the energy underneath denial is a fierce protection for our loved ones or a fierce protection of ourselves. There's something too painful. Let's say with a family member, their loved one is using substances or they have mental health issues or all of the above. And it's so painful. I don't want them to suffer. And so behind that denial is this fierce protection of maybe if I can just make it go away, maybe if I, give enough money, maybe if I let them do what it is they want to do. Maybe if I don't set boundaries, then everything will be okay. So if we take that energy, instead of saying, well, you're in denial, which doesn't leave a person knowing really where to go from that, and often gets used like you're in denial means you want your loved one to not get better, which is true, and say, look, you're very fiercely protective of your loved one. And the ways you've been doing that, the ways you've been protective haven't helped. And they haven't helped not because you don't love, not because you don't care. They haven't helped because addiction and mental health issues don't play by the same rules.
Right.
And so things that would help someone who had cancer or lupus or financial issues because they were laid off because of the economy don't help if someone's got substance use or mental health. So we want to come in and use that fierce protective energy and ask families to step outside of their comfort level and act and respond in ways that are different than they're normally used to, or even programmed to. We get all these messages like you have to be nice to everybody, and, families don't turn their back on their loved ones. And, and I'm not saying families should turn their back on their loved ones, but there are definitely ways to take better care of oneself and their family member who's suffering than maybe would work for the general public. Our cultural norms, our religious norms don't come in and talk about how do we really help someone with mental health issues. So
Right.
long
Yeah. And
this one is delusional disorder. Sorry.
no, that's wonderful. Yeah. I mean, and we've opened up a lot of tabs that we can go down. So that's great. I mean, how, with your over 35 years of experience, does it get to a place where you're just like, how am I still talking about this after all these years, that the conventional wisdom hasn't shifted to this degree of understanding where when we're dealing with addiction, we're dealing with mental health disorders, that it's not playing by the same rules. So our responses and our approach needs to be different. That families need to be informed in a different way. And status quo is and was never going to be effective because of what we're dealing with. And yet people find themselves on the same hamster wheel.
Well, I think, you know, so the benefit of having done this for 35, actually almost 40 years, is that I've seen a lot of progress in the field. Like when I first started working in the field in 1983, there was a lot of conflict about, was it an illness? Was it not? Could you give, benzodiazepines to someone who was addicted? Teenagers, there was a myth that teenagers couldn't have it because they didn't have as much history and they were put on psychiatric units. So in a lot of ways, we've evolved, and we've evolved a lot, I think, because of several different issues. One is that our research, our technologies, our ability to come in and do brain imaging has really helped us to understand addiction more, about it. The people have got a dysregulated, broken dopamine system, and that's really the cause. But in the 70s, they weren't sure if it was the pancreas or the brain or the stomach. So some of it's been, as we've learned more, we've been able to really assimilate and really grow and modernize the way we treat substance abuse and addiction. But the same, again, initially, like we had sort of, I always think of it like a braid, maybe because I ride horses and we braid the manes. So I, think about it like that. But we had like these areas. We had the medical research where you even had like Dr. Silkworth and Dr. Jelinek. And then we had simultaneously working our addiction pioneers. We had, Bill W., we had AA, we had 12 steps. We had, the beginnings of, Vern Johnson, Sharon Wakescheider Cruz, Claudia Black. And then over on this side, separate from it all, we had our family therapists who were Salvador Minuchin, Jay Haley, Chloe Medanis, Carl Whitaker, many others. So they were all working and really kind of doing what melded into or combined into where we're at today. And the medical people and, were sort of over here in, again, the late 50s, they finally came back around and said, okay, well, it's a disease, but we don't really know how that fits. We're trying to, it's an allergy. Then we had our addiction folks coming in and saying, okay, well, it is an illness. It is an allergy. Let's learn more about it. Let's help the person who's suffering. And then Sharon Wakescheider comes in and says, the alcoholic's not the only one suffering. In fact, the families are suffering too. And then Claudia Black came in and said, so are the kids. So from there, we have many other pioneers in our field that worked on that. But at the same time, Salvador Minuchin was working with families who had children who had anorexia. And he was beginning to notice patterns and say, gee, it was very controversial when he said it, but he said, it seems like families that work like systems, which they do, have someone who is in pain or suffering, our identified patient, this anorexic teen. He goes, it seems like there's a payoff for the family in having someone in there sick. Let's go in and look at these family dynamics because it's unconscious. Initially that came out and people were like, how can you say families want their kids anorexic? It wasn't what he was saying.
Right.
He was saying like looking from a systemic. So Virginia Satir was beloved across the board. And she was kind of the one who helped interpret and brought in a lot of the issues around family, a lot of the family therapy principles, which do talk a lot about strengths in family and resilience. And coming in, Judith Landau's done a lot of work on this, coming in and saying, let's not pathologize the family. But also coming in, we need the addiction people too, and the medical piece, because early on, family therapists would say, if you come in and do the family work or you do the trauma work, everything will be okay. Which if you're a good alcoholic or addict like me, you go, oh, okay, if I do this family work, I can go back out and use successfully. Not true. Because we've got, again, a different brain chemistry. So I think that, there's still some kind of old school, archaic ways of thinking, but more and more people are talking about, let's look at what worked. Like tough love. If tough love worked, we would have been able to just get rid of teen addiction in the 80s. But it doesn't. And sometimes kicking a kid out onto the street's not the best thing.
Right.
I mean, more often than not, it isn't. So, how do we really take what we know today and come in and work with people in a way that's compassionate, caring, responds to the fact that almost everyone with substance use disorder or mental health issues has had some kind of trauma. And at the least, struggling within yourself with hearing voices that aren't there or doing things that go outside of your moral compass because you're high cause us trauma within ourselves. So there's an element of trauma across the board. So it's really about how do we come in and really help support people in as kind, caring, and compassionate and non-shaming way as possible.
I guess my curiosity, it lies in the how do people initially come to terms with the fact that my loved one is struggling with an addiction or a mental health problem, and that means we're going to have to step in to have some form of intervention in order to get them the help that they need, because they're not going to seek that help on their own because of the very nature of what they're suffering with. Right. So I think the approach has improved where it's not tough love and there's more positive reinforcement and there's more of kindness and compassion and even an understanding, I think, from people of that there have been traumatic instances and trauma. We're just talking about how a person processes events. It's not necessarily the severity of the event itself, but they've had these experiences. So I feel like there's a lot more compassion. But then on the flip side, I'll hear from parents who are calling me and they'll say, well, I was just trying to be, like compassionate and, kind of more positive reinforcing. And it's like, yeah, but the train can't stop. We have to do something about helping them stop also. And it's still like that is not on the forefront of people's minds yet.
Yeah. So I have a few thoughts about that. One is that I think if we can model, I think what a parent thinks is compassion isn't helpful. Like, again, if we come in and say, does it support health or does it contribute to demise? Like, let's take a look at it through that. And so by us changing our language with families and saying to them, you can do this, we're going to ask you to step outside of your comfort level. We're going to ask you to do things like, not give little Billy money when he's begging for it, but if he's hungry, give him a sandwich because you don't want to buy his drugs. We're going to ask you to come in and put in different kinds of boundaries, that we can help model that and educate parents about how to do that in a compassionate way. Because I think compassion, the way you just described it, parents want to be nice, they want to be kind until they get mad and then they're mad. But often, again, if my child is acting out as a teenager and more than anything wants to go to college, and I know there are all kinds of red flags everywhere, it's not nice to let them go ahead and go. In fact, think of it as like there are things we're going to ask families to do that are going to hurt. They're going to be painful, like changing the way they interact and setting boundaries. But if they don't do those things, they're harmful in the long run. So it may hurt now, but it doesn't cause as much harm. Taking a step back from that, because I think your questions are so good. We've not done a great job of really educating at a grassroots level our families. Like our families don't know what addiction is. They don't know what mental health issues look like, and they shouldn't. They're not diagnosticians. But we have come in and help families to know what it looks like, know what the signs and symptoms are, know that it's not disgraceful to ask for help. I mean, I talk a lot about looking at our kids in elementary school. Our kids in elementary school have tornado drills, fire drills, active shooter drills, God forbid. But where are our addiction drills? Because our kids are far more likely to die of an overdose these days from 13 up than they are from tornadoes or fires. I don't even want to broach active shooting because that's just a whole nother. But again, where is that preparation? And where are we in preparing our families, just like we did around smoking, just like we do around cardiac disease, other illnesses, breast cancer for women? Where have we been at it talking to families about how to have that discussion around the dinner table so that young age they're able to see it, or when kids see it in their friends, they are able to say, hey, we're concerned, we're worried, here's help, and help's not a bad thing. So it's a
Yeah.
bigger picture, it has a lot to do with, our ideologies and what we put out as a culture.
Right.
And I think sadly and tragically, the opiate epidemic and the fentanyl is really beginning to change that a lot. People have more of awareness and there's not as much time. I mean, our kids are using pills for the first and second time and overdosing and dying because there's poison in the drugs. So there's not
Right.
even, most kids, like it or not, experiment. And there's
Mhm.
not really a lot of room for experimentation these days either. It can be deadly.
Right. Right. Yeah. And there does seem to be like almost a stigma to helping your addicted loved one. Right. And so we're talking just like in a crude based sort of way where people will be like, well, why are you helping them? Why are you giving them money? Or why are you doing this? And so there's this feeling of, oh, I'm wrong for trying to be helpful and trying to do the best I can. Right. And not necessarily knowing what I'm supposed to do. And so it's like, stop enabling. And that's what, and so, okay. And then that looks like we're going to go to the other extreme now. And we're going to do something like you mentioned earlier. We're going to kick them out. And in the hopes that's going to be, something. But I feel like the other problem is that, if the house is on fire, you know who to call for help. You're going to make that phone call if you just see signs of smoke. But when it comes to addiction, it's not like people know, oh, we need to visit Heather's website now. Or we need to learn about how do we intervene? How do we step in? That's not the first ubiquitous response to we've identified that our loved one has an addiction. So now this is what we're going to do.
Well, and often there are layers to that too. So often someone doesn't just immediately go to, I need an intervention.
Mhm.
I need to put my kid in treatment. And sometimes, again, it's too much early on. But I think helping therapists understand and pediatricians understand and ER doctors understand, again, here are different layers of help, here are different places to go and to get the help, that parents shouldn't know exactly what to do. I mean, again, because we haven't educated as well as we could, families, everyone who's had an experience with it will say, well, here's what I did. My kid went to jail and they weren't going to get better till they went to jail, or my kid had to bottom out, or my kid, and what works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. And that's really important. And that's where, again, we have specialists that can help. And I think letting people know more about the fact that there are therapists who specialize in addiction, there are interventionists if they're needed, there are educational consultants if, someone's willing to go, but they don't know where to go or what to do. And part of the problem is, we've had a lot of bad players along the way.
Hmm.
So you said, what if someone gets on the internet? Well, the problem is that someone does it when parents do get on the internet. Like that's the first place they're going to go because they Google everything today and research and check things out. And so we've got a lot of bad players out there. Like some of the worst facilities in the country have the best websites and the
Mhm.
highest SEO. And then you run into the, really dangerous things that can happen, like patient brokering and people offering to fly people, pay for their airline tickets to fly them in and buying them insurance and all this illegal, harmful stuff that can happen. So in some ways, we need to be looking at how do we regulate our industry. If you had a parent and they Googled and there was a 1-800 number for help, they're going to call it. They're not going to know any differently. What we know is that the majority of those help centers don't say, here's the best place based on, again, clinical information, what's going on with the child. Do you have any, like, let's get a history. They're going to refer to the place that gave them the most money that day. And that's like
Mhm.
human auctioning. So again, there's a bigger problem. It's multi-layered in what we need to do to help our families get help. But I do think that understanding education, more right players talking, about it to families, to schools, to, places of worship, all of the systems out there that need help. And ideally, we'll be able to, when crisis happens or something happens or someone's overdosed, have, the voice of addiction medicine, also right there on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, BBC, right there also saying, when this happens, here's how you get the help.
Yeah. And have that, I feel like there are some websites and or TV stations that might say that, but the number that they're linking to is kind of generic.
Right. Yeah. And that's the problem.
Right.
If I called up a doctor and said, I have leukemia, they're going to want a lot more information. They're not just going to say, well, okay, how old are you? Okay, go here. And
Right.
same with mental health and substance use disorder. There are a lot of things that play into it. There are a lot of facets. There are a lot of ways to come in and really do a good, take a good clinical history to make the best, recommendation you can. And often that starts with like a 3 or 5 day evaluation where neuropsych testing and medical care and collaborative information from loved ones is really helpful in trying to unpack what exactly is going on. Because if you don't know what you're treating, you're going to send someone for treatment and it may not be, you're not treating the right thing. If you're not treating the right thing, it's discouraging for the client. It's discouraging for the families. It can be thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And traditionally, it's starting to change, but traditionally, the substance use field would say things like, well, they just don't want it, or they just haven't thought it out, rather than saying, we're the professionals. We need to get in here and look at what can we do differently? What's missing? Are we treating the right thing? Are we not? Are there cognitive issues that are getting in the way? And how do we really put together the best treatment plan possible for the whole family system for sustainable health?
Right. Which again looks like a lot of front end assessment prior to even walking through the door of what facility you've selected. It's like the worst thing is to, now we're in crisis, and to call the first 800 number. I think, for all the risk factors that you mentioned, but now just to arrive at the other place of a 28-day treatment program, to have your loved one go and do that, complete the program, come home, and then return to substance use within 30 days of leaving, the family arrives at the conclusion that treatment doesn't work. And that was a big waste of time, and we're never going to do that again. And so what are we going to do when really it's like perhaps that wasn't the best place for them to go to from the very start?
Or they were missing issues like trauma or a serious dual diagnosis, or like depression or a severe anxiety disorder or bipolar, and also that the family didn't get the work that they needed. And sometimes 28 days just isn't long enough.
Right.
Particularly if you're looking at adolescents and young adults whose brains aren't fully matured.
So what do you recommend for adolescents?
So for adolescent and young adult, almost exclusively, there was the National Institute of Health put out a statement years ago that said anything less than 90 days for a teenager is ineffective. And I believe that to be true. And again, for a lot of teens, again, they're immature, and the brain's not developed. The part of the brain that says, go do it now, if it feels good, do it, isn't able to communicate with the frontal cortex that says, well, let's think this through. It's maybe not a good idea. So you've got all the impulsivity. A lot of the drugs like marijuana, really inhibit brain growth. Like marijuana, can damage the myelination process of the brain, which is how the brain grows and matures. So you've got that, but then you've also got complicated family systems that kids are trying to navigate. So you've got, more often than not, parents that are divorced, custody issues. Add to that bullying in school, different issues, with school that can be very complex, substance abuse within the family system. I mean, it's a lot. And most of the kids are using or getting their drugs at their schools. So we'd never say to an adult, go back and hang out at your bar and get sober. But yeah, with children, with teenagers, we're saying, here, now you're going to go back to school where all your old friends are, all the old triggers, and people are passing around pills during lunch break. So it's difficult. It's hard. So they need longer, and often they need to, look at different alternatives, to finish out their schooling, maybe a change of school, maybe a boarding school, or maybe go back to the regular school, but with much more support.
Yeah. And so if for a family that's listening, they go, well, that sounds like too much. How do you get them to, so, this is a very sad story, right? But there's someone recently in the community that I'm in, a 12-year-old committed suicide. And so if you were to somehow, and of course it's almost morbid to think, and, but if you were to say, well, my child is 10 and in 2 years they may be gone. What would I be willing to do now in order to prevent that? How do we communicate the stark reality of that today, that your 15-year-old who is just beginning to potentially like experiment with alcohol and or pills and marijuana, which has a higher degree of potency than ever before, that within a couple of years, they could be dead?
Well,
What would you be willing to do differently?
the issue is that sort of, like scare tactics don't work. Like we could say 5 years, your kid could have cancer within 5 years, and parents are going to go say, well, they may, but they may not. I think part of the way to come in and help address that, again, like with teen suicide, it's a big problem. It's doubled in girls since the pandemic. And, we don't do enough education. I mean, if you think about it, like what have you seen on TV lately that addresses suicide, signs and symptoms of suicide, what to do if someone is suicidal, the resources available? Again, often if someone tries to harm themselves, or they get maybe a 72-hour hold on a very scary, dangerous psychiatric unit that can often be even more, just as traumatizing. And then there's an average of a 6 to 8 month wait for most people to be able to get in with a psychiatrist,
Mm.
much less therapists. So we are, we don't have a lot of resources out there that we need. We don't have a lot of brick and mortar places that can come in and help. And we don't spend a lot of airtime. We'll talk about, okay, suicide in teens is up. But just because we know the problem doesn't mean that we know the solutions or what to do differently. And so again, it's really difficult for families. I mean, things like salmonella and jalapeno peppers get more airtime on TV and news
Mm.
than teen suicide and teen overdose and the epidemic that we have with mental health issues. And so again, some of that is all of us. We have town halls here in the county I live in, and we have them about once a quarter. And at one point in time, they asked all the parents had to participate, or they asked them to, and it was strongly required. You know. And we would educate about suicide. We would educate about ADD and does your kid need medication or not? And we would educate about substance use and where kids would hide drugs and what it looks like and what the signs and symptoms are and that sort of thing, and then give solutions. But if we're not doing that, it's almost impossible for parents to know how to reach out and what to do. And it's really hard. You're right. If someone's got their own values and beliefs, you can't come in and just tell them, hey, you got to do this differently, because you got to meet families where they're at. And that was sort of a piece of the tough love, telling parents they had to kick their kids out of the house. So if they did it, they weren't able to stick to it and they let them back in anyway. So
Yeah.
we as professionals can come in and say, this is going to work the best. This is what we recommend. But if families aren't able to do it, it's important to not shame them and say, okay, well, let's look at how this worked out. And sadly, we lose kids. We lose people every day. And that's a really unfortunate, tragic part of this illness. The same with any illness. When I was in private practice, I worked with a lot of families of children who had juvenile diabetes, and it was hard.
Hmm.
Halloween, their 6-year-olds are wanting candy and they want to go trick-or-treating, and they didn't want to check their blood sugar and they didn't want to prick their fingers. And it was really difficult. And there were some parents that had a hard time fighting that battle and saying you have to do it, even though they knew. So I think it's helping them understand and come in and say, what's getting in the way for you? What's stopping you from that? Is it generationally something that, happened to you? Is it this I'm Southern, so Southern belief, you have to be nice to everybody. And, we don't want to force our kids to, we also have this sense now of, how important our child's well-being is. And so does that get carried to extremes? Well, they don't want to take their medicine. So I don't want to upset their sense of well-being. So again, we have to really help understand families and get to the root of what's getting in the way of people being able to get that kind of help. Often family members will believe, if my child is here with me, they're safer. And 90% of the time, that's true. And there's that 10% where the kid's bringing drugs into the house or they commit suicide right there in their own home.
Yeah. I mean, so a practical point that I would mention, since we've brought it up a couple of times now, the idea of like kicking them out. The reason I find that's ineffective, right? And because it doesn't take on the intervention standpoint, which is don't just kick them out. You have to say, if you're not going to be willing to take us up on this opportunity over here, be far better than continuing down the path that you're on now, then it puts us in this difficult position where we're going to have to ask you not to live with us anymore. We'd much rather you go to this rehab or to speak with this counselor or attend these meetings to do something. But if that's not something you're going to be willing to do, then okay, we're going to have to honor that. But then you're going to have to honor you're not living here anymore.
Right. Because often, again, that's a good point too, that often parents have got other children in the home. It's disruptive, it's dangerous. But the parents have to be at that place and it has to make sense. It can't be sort of punitive or
right.
Again, I think if parents don't understand why they're doing something and they're just told to do it, it's not going to be effective because none of us are really great at being told what to do. And then you often have, you've got more than just one parent if we're talking about kids and young adults. So both parents have to be in line. So if one parent's in agreement and the other one isn't, we know how disastrous that is.
Yeah.
So I think coming in and helping them understand and explain. And then again, you can't take something away from someone without putting something in its place. So to say you have to stop or else what, they don't know how to stop. They don't have the tools to stop. They don't have that, the interventions necessary. The family doesn't know what they need to do to help stop. Families will, they try everything. I work with them all the time and they'll go through lists of, well, we begged, we pleaded, we got angry. We gave in. We thought if we, offered up a new car or, we would lighten up on the rules or, they try everything they can. And often they just need some help understanding why those things aren't working.
Right.
And helping them also understand that your children don't run into difficulties because you're bad parents. That we've all made mistakes as parents. And particularly those of us who are parents who are also in our own recovery. Our kids may have grown up on the other side of our substance use disorder. We have made mistakes. We do make mistakes. But also understanding that if you come in and really work to repair those things, if you're in recovery yourself, and that a lot of it just boils down to brain chemistry. You have a family of 4, all parented the same way, and one has substance use disorder and the other 3 don't. It's just sometimes there's no rhyme or reason.
Right.
It's not feel like I've been bad. And there's something wrong with me. What did I do?
Yeah, which should indicate that it has nothing to do with you, right? Because 3 out of 4 don't have this particular medical issue, right? And so the one that does, it requires, like as we opened, it requires a unique prescriptive response. There is a path for dealing with it. It's just one that's going to have to likely be determined on an individual assessment basis to just find, but it's not complex, right? I mean, how long do your assessments usually take? It's 30 to 60 minutes of kind of talking through, getting the parameters of what's happening with the individual, and then you start to come up with a plan?
I think it can be complex. I think, part of what we do is we get individual confidential histories from multiple family members. If it's a teen We will take a look at neuropsychological testing. We'll talk with other providers. Because it's near impossible to unpack in 60 minutes what exactly is going on. You can't get an accurate history. You've got a stressed person on the other end of the phone. Particularly with intervention, the last person we meet is the person we're intervening on. So we're gathering this collaborative information. And so I do think it can be a really difficult, complicated, complex process that needs a lot of, again, training. Often, again, if you're looking at eating, disordered eating, mental health issues, it can get very complicated. Some things can mirror and look like other things. So often we'll send someone to a program first that does like a week to 10-day evaluation. I mean, probably the best practice, if you've got very complex, complicated issues, is to really look at an evaluation that can help really take a look at, is this a drug-induced psychosis? Was there history beforehand? What kind of neuropsych testing do we have? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Would it be reasonable to say, though, that your cases people are coming to you, you're like one of the foremost experts in handling complexity, right? So, I mean, people that are really trying to sort out, like on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 10 every time people are coming to you. Whereas sometimes I'm getting phone calls where it's like, an 18-year-old who's smoking weed and has started taking pills and has, maybe is not showing up for work. And that's kind of like the first signs of red flags. And it's, okay, where can we get him started? I feel like I want to encourage families to just be proactive, that maybe it's not going to be like something that's, again, I'm just kind of like sensitive to the arduous early beginnings of it all, and not necessarily waiting for it to become so complex that like now it's like we really, we're desperate and need to find, something very serious to do here,
Well, and I do think that's, a good point. Like particularly 18, 19, 20-year-olds, like that's the age group where we will have the highest number of psychiatric hospitalizations. That's where a lot of mental health issues that don't manifest in adolescence will start to come through. So it's good, like when taking that history, to look at, has this been a slow decline, or is this someone who functioned really well and it looks like they've now just taken a huge tumble? Because those can be different underlying issues. I don't know what other people's clients look like. I do know that ours are complex, but I also, from talking to my colleagues and conferences too, I think the issues that we're all dealing with across the boards, all the clients that we're working with, things have gotten more complex. There are more issues. We've got kids that are coming out of unusual high schooling because of the pandemic and isolation, and we're more in tune to different forms of trauma and even vicarious trauma, and what the kids are witnessing, living in a world with, again, shooting and war and natural disasters, and the internet's access to things on the dark web that they see that can be traumatizing. So it definitely does get more complex. And, again, that's the part. Some of that stuff doesn't even get unpacked until someone's in treatment. And that's
right.
Of having a good facility that can also continue to really, again, there's what everyone knows. And then we know that teenagers are really good at hiding things, and their use is different. They don't use every day, but when they use more, they're sneakier about it. So when it does start to present itself, parents will say to me, well, they've only used 3 times. But once the kid gets into treatment, they realize, well, they only got caught 3 times, and it was much more than that. They're only getting the tip of the iceberg. So to have a facility that encourages that kind of openness and is continuing to really take a look at other issues that may have also gotten a kid to get into a place where they're in so much pain at such a young age. There's a big difference between our clients that need treatment at 18 and our clients that need treatment at 40.
Sure. Do you have family programs, educational things that families can go to and use to start to maybe identify these things early?
Well, like I was talking about, the educational component in the communities and schools, encouraging parents to do that. There's a really good website. It's called Reel, REEL, and it's for parents to help educate them more about substance use disorder, what it is, what it looks like. A lot of professionals contributed to that program, the Reel program. Lori Dew, who's been an excellent outspoken advocate for substance use disorder, she used to be with Fox and CNN, has helped really spearhead that. So that's something that's really good. And then, for us, when families come in and work with us, I won't do an intervention for a family unless they agree to work with us for 6 months. And in that, again, because my belief is that our identified patient is the family system. So in that, I have licensed counselors, marriage and family therapists, clinical social workers, counselors. So we're concurrently doing the work with the family while their loved one is in treatment so that they begin to do and shift. And, again, we always hope that we encourage Al-Anon and Nar-Anon and Families Anonymous. We encourage them going and participating in the family programs that the treatment centers have. But after the pandemic, a lot of the programs, family programs were truncated or went virtual. And so what we've found is there's not the same kind of information and education for families in that way.
Right.
But I think prior to, it is more difficult. I do think, again, in Atlanta, we've got a place that we've got several groups. One's based out of a church, one's sponsored by a treatment center where they come together bi-monthly or some weekly and do education, around substance use disorder. And I think that the more that, and you don't have to have a child in treatment to go to that. But I think the more of those kinds of programs that we can offer in our communities and make sure that, schools want to say, well, we don't have a problem here. Well, we know they do, encouraging the school counselors and social workers and even the resource officers to put out these resources for families as well and have them be free of charge so that they can go and get educated about it.
Yeah. You ever have anybody when you were in high school, did you have anybody come and talk about their personal stories and talk about the dangers of alcohol and drugs and things like that you can remember?
Well, so I was in high school a long time ago, in the 70s. And, again, we didn't have people in recovery coming and sharing their stories, but we had things like the DARE program. We heard a lot about, how dangerous drugs are. We had, again, the famous commercial of the frying pan. This
Right.
brain. This is your brain on drugs. And one of my friends, actually, when she was in graduate school, did a study where she had a large subject population. She interviewed like 5,000 teenagers in high schools and said what works and what doesn't. And across the board, the kids told her, when you come in and bring in someone who's in recovery, first off, if it's an old person, forget it. But even if they're in their 20s and they tell us about their story and they're sober, we learn, well, they did it and they got away with it and they're okay now. So why am I going to do anything any differently? So part of it, I think, is that our drug education starts in high school. Well, the average age of first use is 12.
Right.
So we've already missed the boat there. So I think there are ways to come in and start educating much younger. And then the other thing that the teens talked about that had an impact, they did say there was a program for a while and it was focused more on drunk driving, but they would have someone would be kind of like the Grim Reaper, and they would come in and they would tap someone in the class and they would leave. And the point was that you could lose this person at any given time. And they said that sort of in the moment impact meant more to them. They felt more, they had a more visceral response to it. So again, I think it's how we learn. I do think it's our responsibility to educate about drugs and the dangers of drugs and all that. And I do think it's important to come in and educate about who's high risk, genetic factors. I mean, we know a lot today in 2025 about who's high risk. We have, volumes of research that come in and show if you've had trauma, if you've had an alcoholic parent, if, come from, if you've been bullied, if, we've got lots of information.
Mhm.
And yet, we have, a lot of the information we have about child abuse, for example, we have reports that are made to Department of Child and Family Services. We have kids that, are in the system, but we're not coming in and educating this high risk group about their dangers, the dangers
Mhm.
of substance use, So why don't we do that? Well, we don't have enough resources. We're trying to get the kids safe. We're trying to triage it. But again, I think it does boil down to needing more resources earlier on. Kids who have difficulty with coping skills have a more difficult time and are more likely to reach out to substances to curb that, or media addiction, or a lot of the
Mhm.
behavioral addiction, eating disorder, a lot of different issues that can come into play.
Knowing what you know about addiction, even if we were to inform these kids about the risk factors, abstinence really the only thing that we're going to be able to, assert as a possible solution for this until you are at least the age of 25 when your brain is officially out of the woods of developing, right? Because if you take any substances and you do have these risk factors, I know for me, as soon as I started, both of my parents were in recovery growing up. I knew exactly where to go, what alcoholism was. I knew help was available. I knew it worked. All of the people around my parents everybody was sober. It was a wonderful thing. The moment I got drunk for the first time, none of that occurred to me. None of it. And it never occurred to me to ask for help for any of the feelings that I was feeling after, because now I had alcohol to rely on. And then alcohol led to all the other substances that I then took, and I had those to rely on. It never occurred to me. And if it hadn't been for my mother stepping in when she did, I don't get help the day that I did, right? And so that's the kind of information that I think parents need to know, right? It's not about, like teaching the teenagers who are no doubt like 93% chance of taking a substance at some point in their teen years. It's the parents to know if and when they do, here's the likelihood, these are the risk factors, and like this is what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to circle the wagons within a year's time or so, because this is what's likely going to happen.
And here are the signs and symptoms. I mean, that
Right.
was what was different for you, is that your mother knew what it looked like. She knew where it was headed, and she was able to see it and step in and intervene. Like the minute, if your dopamine system is off, the minute you use, like those of us, myself included in recovery, I can tell you exactly the first time I used, what it felt like, what I was wearing, where I was at, what happened, because we bang with it. And it doesn't mean that everyone who has that experience is going to go on. Like, again, you have to put enough alcohol on your brain to be able to, have that shift happen. It's like once a cucumber can always become a pickle, but if you don't stick it in vinegar, it won't. So there are people who probably are genetically predisposed, and that experience maybe even does somehow get their attention. But often it doesn't, So again, sometimes parents, again, being realistic, I'm the first one to tell parents, you should not have the rules around your house that if you drink here, it's safer than if you drink somewhere else. You do need to say, I don't support it. I don't encourage it. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for you. But then if the kids are doing it, to have that open communication. What was it like for you? How did you feel? Let's talk about how much you did it. And again, the most important thing too is for parents to know what you're looking for when it becomes trouble. In our household, anybody's subject to a drug test. And that's just the way it is, because it's dangerous and there's a predisposition here, and we want to be safe. So yeah, but again, I think, I feel like broken record, but boiling down to helping parents know like what to look for, and that it's not a disgrace. There's so much stigma that gets in the way and makes it difficult. And then there's also a not understanding. I mean, teenagers, kids go from loving their parents, clinging to their parents, puberty hits, and all of a sudden their friend group becomes more important. They don't, like the worst thing you can do is like walk on campus with your kid, and they're like, you showed up, oh my God, And so helping parents to also understand, because there are a lot of things that look like normal teenage development and tasks of adolescence that can also be signs and symptoms of addiction, like pushing your family out. So how do we help them understand? But again, that's why
Hmm.
we've got all of these professionals,
Right.
out here, well trained, that can come in and say, you know, this is, let's keep an eye on it.
Hmm.
This could be normal teenage behavior. Let's pop a drug test and see. Let's do a hair test. Let's take a look so we can rule this out and know it's not an issue.
Yeah, that's excellent. And being able to
Well,
communicate in that way. A lot of my resources are dedicated to that
yeah.
very thing,
Yes.
especially for parents. Do you remember your first intervention?
I do remember my first intervention. So I was trained in the original Johnson model back in 1986. And what I can tell you about it all is that I had a level of discomfort with how
Mm.
interventions were done then. I remember not feeling comfortable being dishonest with the person about how we got them to the meeting, because I felt like, why are we going to tell someone they're coming to a birthday party and then it's, we're going to lie to them to get them there and then tell them they need to go be honest with their life. I wasn't comfortable with the lack of transparency, and I wasn't comfortable with, back then, the way we were taught. And again, it was better than nothing. We were learning. We were just trying to, we were getting started. We only knew what we knew about family
Mhm.
systems and all that. So I don't say it critically. I say it with a lot of respect, in the fact that it was the beginning of a building block. But it also, like, we came in with a laundry list of everything the person had done wrong. And
Mm.
they were supposed to say a feeling about it. The family was, again, but you couldn't say angry. And as a woman in recovery who got sober at 21, who came in with extremely low self-esteem, I didn't need to hear. So my first interventions, I did often paired up with other professionals. I started my career working with addicted physicians. So a lot of my interventions were going out with them and doing interventions. But the model back then put a pause on my doing interventions, really until mid to late 90s, when I became open to more experience, learned more about more invitational models, different ways of going in, more compassionate models,
Mhm.
that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, can you explain a little bit of that for anybody that they only think about intervention in the one kind of surprise, or or thinking that it's still a tough love model? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
what does
So,
that look like?
so for me, again, it's always safety first. So there are times when you have to go in and do it by surprise.
Hmm.
For example, if you've got a teenager who's going to run away in the middle of the night, or you've got you've got child endangerment, you've
Hmm.
got domestic violence, there are ways that you have to do it in that way. But I also work with families, again, on, even when you have to come in as a surprise, the least amount of dishonesty. Like, don't have some big elaborate plan or this and that, and then really, how do you respond to that as a professional coming into a situation where a person is saying, you didn't even talk to me about it, you blindsided me with this, for the professional to step in and talk about why, and then to say, if you would have shown up if we'd asked you, that's on me, not on the
Hmm.
family. I apologize for that. That was my technical error. But there are a lot of family members out there where you can say to them, we're concerned and we're worried. We've been working with a professional ourselves to get some help, and we'd like to have a family meeting. And you don't have to go into, we're going to talk because we want to have an intervention, want to have you go to treatment. You
Right.
know, but they at least get that notice, and they're at least told that people are worried. And so it's a little less out of the blue. I mean, if someone doesn't show up for the meeting, then you can always pivot and go surprise. But then it's not really as much of a surprise. Again,
Right.
unless you've got someone, again, life threatening, just was administered Narcan, is back out using again. I mean, there are times where it is important, so it's about triaging it. But knowing that no matter what model you use, like, a lot of the teaching I do is, how do we, regardless of the model, whether it's love first, whether it's family systemic, whether it's Arise, how do we overlay and come in from a what place that's trauma responsive towards our clients? How do we soothe their anxiety? How do we help them navigate what's again going to be another traumatic experience, having your family come together again. Often they're surprised. Often it ends up, they say, oh, this is much more loving than I thought it was going to be. That's the
Sure.
goal. But there's still others that, I mean, again, people will say to me all the time, how would you like it if somebody woke you up and, with your whole family there and said you'd have to go to treatment? I wouldn't like it. Wouldn't be
No,
my,
nobody would like
but
that.
nobody likes
Structured.
that. Nobody likes that,
Yeah. Yeah.
So, in looking at, is it necessary? Can we do it in a different way? First and
Mhm.
foremost, but then also how do we make sure everyone is safe as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always big on, let's use the right amount of leverage to accomplish what we're looking to accomplish. Let's not overdo it. And at the same time, conveying to any parents and family members that are listening that there is an option, that there's more than one way of doing this. So don't just arrive at the conclusion like, oh, my kid isn't going to like that. So, we wouldn't do that. Well, there's like probably 10 other ways of doing this than just whatever the worst way is in your mind.
And there's also a lot of research, it goes like, again, I love intervention because I think it's important for the families to be able to know that they've done something. And I do think the loving messages are important. But there is a lot of research that shows that when someone goes to their loved one and says, hey, do you want some help? Often they'll say yes.
Mhm.
Need to go into the extremes of an intervention and that kind of thing. So,
Right.
even just beginning to, I'll often ask my families, have you ever had that conversation before? Have you ever said, I'm worried, I think you need some help? What happened there? And often it's no, because it's that topic we don't want to talk about. Or a person gets angry, and the anger means shut up and quit talking about my using drugs because I don't want to stop. So I'm going to get
Right.
angry and you'll back down, and it works.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's more an eloquent way of saying what I was attempting to say earlier, right? It's like, it's important to know what your wheelhouse is. When I visit your website and speaking with you, it's like, I'm not doing that. That's not the kind of case that I'm handling. The kind of case I'm handling is one where I'm trying to give you pointers over the next 45 minutes on how you're going to get him to say, okay. And that's been 90% of my cases, is just very like kind of, how to have that conversation to get them over the hump, so to speak, So as a personal question, I'm just curious, when did you envision what your business looks like now? How this grew, how you went from, I'm going to be Heather, an interventionist, and to someone who has this, massive, organization that helps as many families as you're able to now.
So I guess like it really started, I don't think I ever really aspired to be an interventionist. I aspired, I went into treatment. I was studying psychology because I thought if I changed my major to psychology, I would quit using so much cocaine and drinking so much. Eventually, not
Yeah.
right away, but eventually I did end up checking myself into treatment. I didn't have an intervention. And once I was in treatment and my head started to clear, I was 21, just turned 21. I realized probably more than anything I'd ever realized that I wanted to be a therapist and that I wanted to help particularly teens that had gone through the struggles I'd gone through and not gotten the help that they needed.
Mhm.
So at that point, I wanted, I did everything I could do to educate myself. I got my undergraduate degree in psychology at Emory. I went off to graduate school. I took multiple trainings. I took 3-year trainings in trauma and experiential therapy. And so for a long time, I did consulting work. I helped open up an adolescent unit. I did consulting work working with the addicted physician population, where I came in and did their trauma treatment. I put together programs to help work with the clients who had eating disorders, anxiety disorders, and I had a large private practice and did a lot of group therapy, couples therapy, got trained in play therapy. I worked with littles all the way up, to the family work and working with, older adults. So part of my evolution was also, part of my own self-care. I have horses. I've always ridden horses. I ride horses competitively. And, when I was in private practice, I did a 4-day week. So I'd have 3 days, off to myself, but I enjoy competing. And so I started trying to look at different ways to shift my practice around. I got trained in equine therapy, didn't like watching people chase my sport horses around. So I'm like, no, it's a great modality. It doesn't work for me.
Mhm.
I got actually trained. I'm an internationally certified hostage negotiator and did the FBI training and some other trainings. And so I added that to my repertoire and do a lot of work with the law enforcement and on, call outs and that kind of thing. And then when I became more, when I became introduced to other models that really spoke to me more than just sort of that basic surprise model, I thought, I like the problem solving of it. I like, I take all the clinical skills that I've gained over the years. Like if people say, what model do you use? It's from having a master's degree and doing a ton and having a lot of tools in my toolbox. So coming in and, I really like doing interventions. So I thought, well, let me do more of these. And the next thing I knew, I was doing like 80 a year. So I let my private practice, I quit taking new clients. So there was sort of an overlap between, it took a couple of years for me to just fully move into this space. And then it was just me. And then I needed some help. So, but I have a lot of
Yeah.
control issues. And I was like, I don't know if anybody can, I don't want anybody
I mean,
scheduling my schedule.
yeah, 80 is a lot.
80
80 is a lot.
So I brought in some help and that worked well. And then as things went on, I really started to look at what were the needs of my families and they needed more support than I was able to give them if I was up in an airplane or sitting with the family. So I began to bring in therapists to work with my team to help support the families. I began, bringing in clinicians that on the front end could work with the families and help also, assess, help them get the histories, that kind of thing done. And so today I feel like, again, it's gradually evolved, but I would say for the last 10, 15 years, I've been to a place where I felt like I feel good about what I do. I feel like we offer our families the best we can.
Right.
Have a lot of support in there, a lot of education. We are really active in communicating with the facilities that they go to so that we can be that overarching, the person is struggling to go into treatment, but we're able to help with that aftercare and again, support the families who need it too. So it's a long answer as I seem to have, but it took time and it took my really looking at what are the deficits, what can I do better, what's the most ethical way for me to come in and help families and their loved ones.
So when did you arrive at that, say, 6 months of family engagement is probably our best approach and the most ethical for you?
Early 2000s. Yeah.
Okay.
And what's the way that's morphed is initially it was my availability. In fact, initially it was my availability for a year. If they needed that, if I needed to go re-intervene. And then I was able to bring in clinicians to be more proactive. So it wasn't just, as crisis oriented that we're able
Right.
we
Right.
do, weekly, biweekly sessions with the families, throughout that time. And
Yeah.
so, and sometimes it's not just the family. We may work with different family members separately, so we try and come in and give a lot of support. And that's taken, time, but I've never felt like it was for me, right to just drop someone off a treatment and say, okay, we're done.
Right. Of course. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I feel better for having had this conversation. I feel very good about being able to recommend your website and to send people your way because it is fully comprehensive. There's so much information. There really is. It's just a wonderful resource. And so, why don't we how do people connect with you? What's the best way to get started?
Well, I think probably the best way to connect is to just go on my website, which is www.heatherhayes.com.
Mhm.
And it's Hayes. I have a good friend that's also Heather Hayes without the E. But go on the website and there's a lot of information. You can Google things you're interested in. And we also have the numbers on there to call. And so call, fill out the little form on the website. And we, really try to not have a lot of lag time with getting back to someone because we know it's urgent. People call us when it's 911, not 411.
Right.
They don't just call for information. They call because they're in crisis. So
Yes. Yeah. My dream is to have it be more 411, to have it almost be something that gets eventually presented in a way that is, oh, okay. I want people, as you mentioned, I want people to have the resource available in the same way that my mother had it, right? That where it's like, oh, I see what's going on here.
yeah. But
I want them to see it too.
kudos and love for mom, because the reason we have so many young people in recovery these days, I believe, is because we have so many parents in recovery too.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
changing that family script, changing the generational, that intergenerational shift where
Right.
sobriety and recovery become the norm.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so for the parents who are not privy to that, though, it's not rocket science. It just takes being willing to say, oh, it could be my kid. That's
Yes.
all.
That's
It
it.
could-
How do I find out if it is my kid or not?
That's it.
I'm not a
Yeah.
diagnostician. Let me get the right help. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So this was really wonderful. Any questions I should have asked that you wish I would have asked that we could have covered?
No, I think we covered a lot. I think you did a great job. Thank you.
I have one more thing that I'm curious about just to see if you have an opinion on this. There's a lot of people on social media that are, like kind of big name therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, child parents, like they're really helpful. They really have a good, like a handle on things. They're working with toddlers, they're working with adolescents and teens, preteens. How do you feel about their knowledge base when it comes to addiction?
I mean, that's such a broad question. I think
I know.
everyone's got a specialization. Some maybe don't know as much, although, there are things that aren't my wheelhouse either that may be theirs or that sort of thing. But, again, I think if we can also help get people who have substance use disorder or intervention background on some of their podcasts, have some of them on your podcasts, again, there's a way that we can all collaborate.
Right.
But none of us can know.
That's why I bring it up.
Yeah. So I think that's, the world is open for collaboration, and social media is a place where that's really happening. It's, a place where you can get some great information and some not so great information. But it's, every time I post a blog, there's somebody, I don't know who, but often I'll post a blog and then someone will come on my social media and go, well, you really need to try this microdosing. And I'm like, you're not putting that on my social media post. So I'll come in and delete it and block them. So again, there's good information out there. There's bad information. Everybody's got an opinion. But I think look at also, again, credibility, who's been doing it for a long time,
Right.
ask, like, do you have other family members you've worked with that we can talk to? Do you have references, recommendations, those kinds of things, just to make sure that it's safe? Because like I said, sometimes the minute you get on the internet, you're often prey to a lot of bad players, and we need to come in and help protect our family members from that too.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for collaborating with me for this chat today. And, I will definitely be highly recommending and linking to everything in the show notes. So thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate your time.
And I'll put it out on my social media too.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much.
So much.